Thank you for that. Good afternoon. We're awake after lunch, that's good. Now here's the thing, normally the IT skeptic is skeptical. And so for those of you who came along today hoping for some of the edgier stuff that you might hear, I might read on my blog, I'm sorry, because today I want to talk about something positive and affirmative and actually useful, which might be a bit of a diversion for the IT skeptic. But, you know, you can't be skeptical all the time, and every now and then ideas come along. And so this is one of those ideas which came to me last year. And talking to a guy called Charles Betz, B-E-T-Z, or B-E-T-Z, where he comes from, and who's one of the leading thinkers in IT architecture and has got a fabulous book out on architectural patterns. But Charles was talking about this thing called case management and how it was something that we didn't talk about enough in IT and was worth a look, and I went and had a look. And it occurred to me that by combining it with some of the concepts that we already have in service management, that this was a really useful thing and that case was something we need to look at more. And as I brewed that, this concept of standard plus case came up. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So standard plus case is an approach, a way of thinking. It's not yet another framework, so relax. It's a different attitude to how we do what we do today. And it's about improving service response. So by service response, I mean humans responding to situations in a service context. So that's incidents, requests, problems, changes, events, car accidents, fires, sick people. I don't care what it is. It's about response. And it's a different way, well, I hope you'll find it different to the way we look at the world today. And I hope it's something that you'll find useful, that you can take back and apply in your context, which I'm assuming for 98% of the people in this room is instant request and problem and the service desk world. And I think it's something really useful for the service desk world. In fact, I find it really exciting, which for anyone who knows the IT skeptic, that's an unusual state of affairs, right? So this is something I want to share with you today. Now, the thing with standard plus case is it helps us address some of the issues that you see around the traps with what I'm going to refer to as traditional IT service management. And when I talk about trad ITSM, you know, I'm talking about the ITIL approach and the way that we think about things so often. Now, any time I speak, it's full of broad sweeping generalizations. So I know this doesn't apply to everybody in the room, so don't get offended if I talk about trad ITSM and you think, well, that's not how we work. Good on you. But, you know, these are generalizations which have some substance and are useful. And so the sort of issues that we hear people speak about are that IT taking a traditional ITSM approach can be seen to be bureaucratic and inflexible. I'm just, hands up if that comes as a surprise to anyone in the room, right? So there is this perception that ITSM makes us bureaucratic, and it's not just the customers that feel that way. The staff can feel process bound. They can feel, you know, don't fence me in. You're stifling my creativity. You know, how can I work under these conditions? I'm an expert. Don't tell me how to do my job. Yeah? So there's this negative response from especially some of our more technical people to say, I don't like this being put into this framework. And let's be frank, that sort of process-centric approach really can be a little inflexible. Once we start standardising and entrenching process, we are potentially reducing our ability to flex to a changing world. And more specifically to service response, there's this issue that the real world falls off the bottom of the page. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm talking about, this is a phrase that a guy called Hank Marquis in the US, who's another really cool ITSM thinker, shared with me. So he talks about, you know, that you've got this checklist or this list of things, responses, the way that you respond, list of categorizations of incidents, whatever. And something comes in and you go, oh, it's not one of these, not one of these. Oh, I've fallen off the bottom of the page. We don't have a defined response to that. So that situation is one that we traditionally, in trad ITSM, often treat as an exception condition. Oh, you know, so if most of you have probably written some code at some stage in your life, a fair proportion of the people. You know, it's that if it's one of these, else, if it's one of these, else, if it's one of these, else, I'm not supposed to get to this point in the program, call error condition, right? So, you know, in our processes, we quite often think that way. I've run out of standard options. This is an exception condition. This is not normal. In fact, sometimes this is an error. What's wrong that I've got to this point? But the real world keeps doing that. One example of that is, and a guy in Australia talked to me about this when I talked about standard plus case. He said, "You suddenly explained what my problem was." He built a request catalogue for his organisation, went away for 6 months building a service request catalogue and came back, ta-da, and they launched it, and only 60% of the incoming requests were in the catalogue. And he got his butt kicked. What's wrong with you that your new service request catalogue doesn't encompass the world, right? Doesn't describe the reality that we're experiencing. Why are all this other stuff not in the catalogue? But the reality is, who's had that experience that the request catalogue didn't cover the world, right? It happens, yeah? And was it treated as a normal thing that it doesn't cover the world? So quite often we have in there a special category of request, which is not in catalogue, right, to try and capture these things. And the other sort of really stereotypical way that this exhibits itself is the long-running incident. So, you know, they run the incident report for the month, and there's these incidents that are 3 weeks or something old, these really long-running incidents. And once again, what's wrong with you people that there are these long-running incidents? Don't you know what the SLA is? Why aren't you closing these? Error condition, failure to perform, yeah? But the fact is that this is reality, that there are incidents that just run and run and run. And never mind what the SLA says. And it's not necessarily so that the people are failing in their ability to perform their job. This is reality. So looking at those sort of issues, this is something that has always concerned me about the traditional approach to ITSM. And so when I looked at Charlie's case management, this little light went on. And all of this stuff is other people's ideas. It's not mine. If there's one little contribution I've made, it's to have that little click in my head to say, standard plus case. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. See, I think a lot of these problems these issues that we're having, stem from the thinking that wants to treat IT as a factory. And we have taken a lot of thinking from manufacturing, from factory-centric approaches, haven't we? TQM out of Toyota, Six Sigma, CMMI, right? So CMMI, define it, make it repeatable, make it standardized, make it measurable, start optimizing it. CMMI is very much a production line approach to IT. And of course, ITIL sucks those concepts up into ITIL itself. Lean's all about factory approaches again. Has anyone read the Phoenix Project? Has anyone read the Phoenix Project? One. You need to read the Phoenix Project. It's a really good book. It's by Gene Kim and Spafford and Bear, who wrote the Visible Ops Handbook from years ago. Remember the little yellow and black stripy book? And so Gene's got DevOps religion, and the Phoenix Project is about the application of DevOps. I think it's a really interesting book. It's full of really good concepts, the 3 ways, and it's really, really powerful stuff. It's also a fairy tale, so please don't drink the Kool-Aid. There are people running around with the Phoenix Project saying, I've found the answer to all our problems, which of course is not how the world works. But it's a really interesting book, and I highly commend the Phoenix Project to you. And it's about the application of lean and DevOps principles to IT. So I like this stuff. It works. We use it. But the issue is that I don't think the analogy of the factory and manufacturing works perfectly for all of IT. I don't think it's a full and complete description of IT. Where is the IT production line? If we're going to apply these manufacturing concepts to IT, which bit of IT do we apply them to? Is it in the build process, acquisition, development, integration of systems? Is that something that we can turn into a production line? The release process, operational change, deployment of systems. That's certainly something that DevOps says we can turn into a production line and automate, in fact, turn it into a machine. Execution, the actual delivery of transactions to the end users. I think that's where the production line is. And Charles Betts talks about this beautifully in his book, is that when we're building IT and running IT systems, what we're building isn't something that's a factory. We're building the factory, right? So what we're doing can't be treated as a factory. We're building the factory. The outcome of what we do in IT is to create the factory plant. And the product that flows through the factory, the product that is transactionalized and standardized and stamp coming out, is the transactions that flow through our IT systems to the end users. That's the production line. The other areas like build and release and also maintenance, doing fixes and upgrades, and support, response, the stuff I'm talking about today, you can apply these factory-ish principles, these manufacturing principles to 1, 2, 4, and 5, but I don't think you can do it fully. I don't think it's a complete description of reality. The analogy starts to fall down. The analogy of manufacturing is incomplete. Does that make sense? So ITIL, let's really get down to our alma mater, our home ground. ITIL talks about standard models. It talks about standard request models, standard incident models. It implies the existence of standard problem models, and it talks about standard change. Standard change has a special meaning to say pre-approved, right? But all of those standard models mean predefined. So when ITIL talks about a standard model, it's saying we've got a predefined model, a predefined template of how to respond to the situation. So when I talk about standard plus case, I'm talking about standard in the sense that ITIL uses the word standard, these standard models. And if, I don't know if you can see it up the back there, but if we've got this generic process that we follow for any sort of ticket where we receive and record the ticket, we categorize and prioritize it, we assign it to someone, they execute, they resolve, then we decide it's complete and we close it. And in the case of a standard model, when we get to the categorize and prioritize, we recognize that it's standard. We pull the standard model, it might be a predefined workflow in your tool, it might be a script, it might be just a piece of paper, it might be a checklist in a book full of checklists for those who are coming to my breakout session later on. whatever it is, somewhere that we pull out that standard model and we execute the model workflow. So that in a standard situation, we've got the workflow and we resolve it. So this is that factory thinking. This is the thinking that says you can standardize these things. And that once you standardize them, you can do that CMM thing. You can make them defined, repeatable, measurable, optimized. You can do the lean thing and squeeze all the juice out of it. You can do the Six Sigma thing and reduce the variation in it, and so on. You can apply all these manufacturing principles. You can do the DevOps thing and automate it all. That's the thinking that comes out of these standard models. But if you look at, so remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the different areas of IT, and the fifth one was support, how we respond to things. If you look at the sort of responses that we do in IT, right, there's a whole range of stuff that we do. Password resets, absolutely you can standardize a password reset. You can make that into a repeatable transaction. But that's not our whole world. And the more you look at the other sort of things that we have to respond to, the more you see that they're only partly standardizable, or even not at all standardizable, some of them. Some of them are, each one that presents itself is completely unique. Yes? So this standard approach to the world doesn't completely and fully describe our response world. Now, there's a thing called the Cynefin model. If there's any Welsh people in the room, forgive me for the pronunciation. It comes out from Dave Snowden, who's Welsh, so the Cynefin model. And the Cynefin model talks about how you respond to a situation, any sort of situation. So this is not IT specific. It's just about when you're in a situation, situations tend to be one of 4 different main sorts, which are there are simple situations where they're known. There are complicated situations where they're knowable if we get somebody, usually somebody with some expertise, to look at them more completely and understand what's going on. Complex situations where they're unknown, and someone's going to have to do some research and learning and exploration in order to determine how we deal with them. And chaotic situations where they're unknowable, where all we're trying to do is restore some sort of control. It's quite a cool model. And another way of phrasing the top 2 ones are a complicated situation is exploitative. We exploit our current capabilities and knowledge and resources in order to go and figure out how to deal with it. And complex is exploratory. We're outside of our normal understanding of the world. We actually have to go and explore and learn to understand how to deal with it. Do you like this model? Who's seen Cynefin? A few? It's hard to see your hands. Not many. It's worth looking at in terms of understanding our behaviours and our interactions and the sort of networks that we generate and all those sort of things, the implications of the different situations that we find ourselves in. So known, knowable, unknown, and unknowable. Got it? And then there's this fifth one of disorder in the middle where we have no idea what state we're in and we're busy trying to work out which one of those we're in. I use in Stanifulus case, I also use the term unfamiliar to say it's something where we're not immediately familiar with. Oops, sorry. So the reality, real world calling, hello, is that responses cannot all be standardized. And this is the fallacy, the false assumption that underpins our standardizing approach in traditional ITSM, which causes all those issues where the request catalog isn't complete, the incidents run too long, we're beating people up for failing to achieve what we've defined as success, is because the world refuses to be standardized. And it refuses to be standardized for 2 reasons. One is because we're dealing with wetware or meatware, another term. People, right? So people refuse to be standardised. People are these cussed, unpredictable, irrational things that refuse to be standardised. And the second reason is because of the complexity of the world, not in the Kinefin sense of complexity, but in the more general sense that the world's complicated. The kind of stuff that we deal with in IT is extremely complex. And so trying to make it predictable, everything that's going to come boiling up out of that soup that we deal with is unrealistic. It's not how the real world works. So we get this thing that I call the fireman's conundrum. And the best way to illustrate the fireman's conundrum is to say, let's talk about what a fireman's SLA would look like if firemen wrote SLAs like IT writes SLAs. Then here's a fireman's SLA for you. If the building is multi-storey or a large commercial complex, then the fire must be put out within 2 hours. If the building is a house on fire, then you've got a day. If it's a grass fire, then you've got 5 days. And if it's a fire in a waste paper basket, then it's a priority 4 and your best efforts to get around to it when you can. It doesn't make any sense, right? Why do we write SLAs like that? A fireman wouldn't write an SLA like that, but we do. We say the bigger and more catastrophic and more complicated and dangerous the situation, the faster we'll resolve it. Hello? So firemen understand this stuff. A fireman's not going to write an SLA like that. What a fireman will commit to is how much effort and what sort of resources they will apply to it. I don't know about here in the UK, but in the US they talk about 1 alarm, 2 alarm, 3 alarm fires, right? And that defines how much resource, what kind of response they're going to do, depending on whether it's a 1, 2 or 3 alarm fire. That's a sensible SLA. You know, an experienced fire chief can look at this 16-storey burning building and say, well, it's probably going to take us a day and a half to put that out, but they're not going to sign in blood for that because they don't know until they get in that building. Everyone's unique. Then there's the doctor's conundrum. And the doctor's conundrum is a little different because a fireman knows what the problem is, the building's on fire, okay? But for a doctor, the first thing is diagnosis. Doctor, how long will it take you to tell me what's wrong with me? More than half of the world's diseases have never been categorised, or in what we're talking about here, standardised. More than half the world's diseases are undescribed. The most common ones are, so he's got a good hope of he or she, right? But more than half are uncategorised. So there's a good possibility that the doctor is looking at something that's never been standardised, never been described before in the world. So unless they're House from that TV show, you can't have any sort of guarantee that they're going to diagnose what's wrong. And then even once they do, and if they do diagnose, after an unknown period of time to which they're not going to commit, then we're onto the fireman's conundrum. Doctor, how long will it take you to cure me? Do you think they write SLAs to how quickly they can cure you based on what's wrong? So the firemen and the doctors understand that the world refuses to be standardised. And they don't try and approach everything in a standard way. They do standardise parts of their world. Where it's possible, they have standard ways of responding and dealing, but they understand that that's not how the world works. And what do they both, well, certainly what do doctors call it when they're dealing with a situation? They call it a case. They're using case management. Lawyers, police, social workers. Case management is this phrase that's used in a whole lot of contexts to deal with a case. And there's this body of knowledge called case management, just like there's this body of knowledge called service management. And it exists external to all of those industry sectors as this generic theory around how you deal with cases. And case management says there is no process. Get used to this, right? Case management says You find yourself in a state, you determine what state you're in, you determine what state you want to get to, you determine what actions are required to get to that state, you determine what resources you're going to need to perform those actions, and you perform them, and then you determine what state you're in now. And you're working towards some final goal, some resolution, but depending on what happens and depending on what you learn, you might even completely change what the outcome is that you're shooting for. So the police get called because there's a dead body, and so they need to dispose of the body, so they arrange for the undertaker to come, and then they discover that there's a bullet hole in the body. Suddenly, the whole state has changed, and in fact, the goal and the outcome has changed. They've gone from clean up the site to solve a murder. Utterly different outcome, depending on what happens as things proceed and as information comes in. So each case is unique, each case is unpredictable, each case the sequence of actions is emergent through the course of the case. For people who are deeply process-centric people, that is an unsettling concept. That's case management. Case management is where knowledge workers live. Now, this is a buzzword at the moment, right? Knowledge workers. And you know, all the millennials want to be knowledge workers. Hey, I'm a knowledge. So this is an emerging concept for us, is this idea of the knowledge worker. The knowledge worker is somebody who's professional, autonomous. They bring their own tool set to bear. As Chris Dancy says, they bring their own knowledge locker, you know, so their knowledge resources are their own, and even perhaps their own brand to bear, you know, their own reputation as the person for this particular thing, right? So the knowledge worker is the sort of person who's dealing with these cases. So specifically, we're talking about a caseworker, and social workers use the term caseworker, right? A caseworker is someone who has the skills to be able to deal with resolving cases, to be able to deal with the fact that they don't have a script, that they're making decisions, that they're deploying resources, that they're managing situations, that they're moving us forward to another state. Okay, that's a caseworker. And that's completely different to the sort of people that you have doing your standard stuff. Yeah? So going back to that Kinefin model that I talked about, the standard stuff that we talk about in traditional ITSM only works in the simple situations, maybe some of the complicated ones. It only works for stuff that we know and understand and can recognize, that is familiar. Case management is what we use to deal with any situation that's complicated or complex, that we don't have enough information to know whether it's a simple one or it's one that we've never seen before. And we're going to have to work out what the process is to resolve it. So the little buzz that I had was to say, hey, if you take the standard approach and this case approach and you put the two together and you call it standard plus case, you get a holistic approach that deals with all possible situations. Marry the two together and now you do have a description of the world as it presents itself, as you need to respond to it. In every situation, there's either a standard model, standard, or there isn't, case. They're like a yin and yang, and in fact, I haven't got time to go into it today, but if you start comparing them on all their different attributes, they're actually a mirror image of each other. They are very complementary or very opposite in their attributes. Now, I'm not saying abandon process, all ye who enter here. I'm saying that the generic process that we have for dealing with standard stuff still applies in any situation. We still receive the ticket, we still categorize and prioritize it, We still go off and see if we've got a standard model. But if we fall off the bottom of the page, if there isn't a standard response, then we branch to where it says case management there, right? And I've drawn that as a fuzzy cloud because there isn't any process once we get to that. So what I'm saying is that in the resolve step of the generic process, we're either doing process or we're doing case. Can you deal with that? So we're not abandoning all process, we're saying as we resolve, we may branch to case. This is very empowering to the customer, because instead of saying to the customer, there's the standardized stuff that's standard change, and there's the standardized stuff which is what's in our request catalogue, and that tiny little blue wedge there, if it's not in catalogue, oh, that's a special thing, or even in some situations, if it's not in the catalogue, bad luck, right? I'm thinking here particularly of maybe some of your outsourcing contracts, right? Instead of saying that to people, we're saying we understand that there's this whole chunk of request that isn't standardized. We're saying we know why it's called request fulfillment instead of request management, because we're not just trying to manage the standard stuff, we're also trying to fulfill your request if it's not one that we're familiar with. So, instead of going, oh, gee, that's not in our request catalogue, it's, yes, that's not a standard request. Let me put you through to a caseworker who will work with you to try to understand your requirements and see whether or not we can fulfill what you need. Now, we are trying to standardise when we do case management. So, once again, out of time today to go into the detail of it, but we are trying to capture the cases that we're dealing with, recognise the ones that are recurring, and saying, we could standardise that, and shoving them back into the rack as a standard model for future, right? So in theory, that pinkish area should expand across. We should be able to standardise more and more of the world over time. But of course, the reality, move all this stuff into standard, but the reality is that life doesn't work like that. As fast as we're standardising, life is chucking new non-standard stuff at us that we have to deal with as a case. So we try and standardise, but life conspires against us. It's also quite empowering, this approach, to the worker and the user. Let me talk about that. First of all, the worker, you've got these people at the moment who say, don't fence me in, don't put me in a box, don't make me do all this standard process for the rest of my life. How many people are seeing service desk analysts who want to be a service desk analyst? My job is service desk analyst, I'm a professional service desk analyst, I want to be a service desk analyst. It's emerging, right? Service desk used to be what you gritted your teeth and stuck with for a year until you could wheedle a job anywhere else in the organisation, right? It was seen as an entry point. But there are more and more people who say, I'm a service desk analyst, it's what I do for a job, I want to do this stuff. And you've got some of them who have been sitting there for 11 years on the phone and they're happy. They like doing this stuff. But you've got to give them some hope for the future. And so what standard plus case kind of thinking gives us is the ability to say, when you first come in here, we're going to give you the standard stuff. When you first come in here, you're going to be doing password resets all day until you certify yourself to be able to do an Active Directory update. Then you're going to be doing Active Directory updates all day. And then as you get more and more certifications, Boy Scout badges for the kind of things that you're allowed to do, you'll get a more and more broad mix of the sort of things you're dealing with. And gamification speak here, hey, eventually, if you've got enough certifications and accreditations and experience and eventually you'll level up to where you're the caseworker. Hey, you're now, the response ninja, 5 stars, caseworker. That's when you're allowed to work on the really crunchy, interesting stuff, the cases. It gives people a future, it gives people a career path, and it also means that the poor bunny who's just started in the service desk isn't getting the cases chucked at them. So it's empowering the worker. It's saying, once you prove yourself, we will let you free. We will let you out from the process constraint. You won't be following the script for the rest of your life. You'll be allowed to work on cases. Now, an interesting thought, and it's slightly tangential, is an idea that, once again, I think Chris Dancy gave me this originally, which is, why can't users certify and level up as well? You know, you're all IT people in this room. You've had that frustration where you ring your telco and you get the voice from the other side of the world saying, have you turned it on? Have you tried? And you're going, look, I'm in IT. I know what I'm doing. Will you please let me speak to somebody who knows something about it? Right? We've all had that frustration. Why wouldn't it be great if we as users could certify this is a user who knows what they're talking about, so that when we first came in for response, we got gated straight to the caseworker? Yep, we accept that you have tried all the diagnostics already. We accept that if you say it's non-standard, then it's non-standard. Go talk to a caseworker. That would be cool. That's a bit tangential though, but the empowering of the workers is the really important thing here that I find exciting, is that for the people on the service desk, they've got a future, they've got a growth, and they've got an end game, which is where they get to be the caseworker. So this idea of standard plus case is new. I've been talking about it for a while, but it's new. And you lot are pretty slow at adopting these new ideas when they come out. So at the moment, if you look around for who's applying this particular structured thinking called standard plus case, or if you look around who's applying case management in general within IT, the answer is not a lot. There's a couple of organisations in Australia who are, one's very well advanced, the other's moving along with applying the stuff in their service desk context. And there's one or two others who are kicking the tyres, people are thinking about it. There's another whole movement called adaptive case management, which is, to crudely characterise it, about the application of technology to dealing with cases in any industry sector, not IT. And they publish a lot of case studies, no pun intended, right? And going through their case studies, there was only one that I could find that was IT specific, which was a Fortune 500 Indian bank using adaptive case management principles within their IT. So if you go looking for examples of people using case in the structured sense, not a lot. Is anyone in the room who can say, we use case management for dealing with service response in our organisation? Anyone? One? Cool. Two? So the thing is that it doesn't concern me that there's not a lot of people doing this, because, in fact, if I took out the word formal, if I said, who in this room deals with cases? Who in the room, your service desk deals with cases? Everybody's hand should be up. It's what you do now. Right? Just like ITIL is documented common sense, standard plus case is just trying to describe the reality of what you do today. But the thing is that we shouldn't be treating it as an error condition or an exception condition. We should be saying this is the real world, that only 60% of the requests are in the catalogue. That's how the world works. That's fact. And we should be approaching it that way. We should be approaching it that way, that this is the fact, this is the reality of how the real world works. We need the standard stuff for when we can standardise it, and we need case management to deal with all the other side of the world. So by formalising that approach, by being more structured in how we think about that side of the world and not treating it as some sort of, oh my God, exception, quick, go find someone expert to deal with this. By formalising how we approach that stuff, we can now start to improve it. So how many people your CSI approach or process or whatever in your organisation looks at improving both the standard and non-standard responses that you deal with? I'll bet it's almost nobody. The CSI focuses on all that standardised stuff, right? It gathers statistical information, it tries to get the mean time to resolve down, it tries to, it's driven around all those manufacturing industrial principles. But by applying case management as a formal methodology to the rest of reality, we can now start to improve our case management. So now we're improving everything. And that, to me, is the key payola of Standard Plus Case. It's really exciting that it empowers the workers and allows them to be knowledge workers. It's really exciting that it empowers the customer and makes us look less bureaucratic when we're dealing with them. But the real bottom line, I think, is that it gives us the ability to improve in a holistic manner across all the responses that we're dealing with in our organisation. No, I'm not going to sing Kiki D. Right? So I've done a book, which you can have a look at on the table out there, anyone who's interested, with a whole lot of the thinking around this stuff. But more importantly, basicsm.com/standard case. Come and have a look. There's a whole lot of additional material and resources there. So if you want to think about this stuff and think about the potential of how it could help, how you could apply it in your organisation, then you'll find it there. So to summarise, Standard Plus Case, first of all, I'm not asking you to chuck away everything. I'm not saying ITIL is wrong, stop doing that. It's not a revolutionary thing, it's an evolutionary thing. It's saying, let's clarify the way we think about this stuff. Let's expand it a little to bring in these concepts of case management, which other industry sectors have been using for years. And so we can draw on the manufacturing analogy and the manufacturing concepts to help us for the standard side of the world, but let's draw on case management to help us with the case side of the world and expand on what we do now, just improve a little on what we do now. So this is not, you know, a massively expensive thing. If you come and talk to me about it, you don't need to retool, you know, you don't need to retrain your people. You maybe want to expand the training of your people, but it's building on what you do right now, and it's formalising what you do already. We are empowering the customers and users, so they're going to be happy about that. They're going to like us. Most of all, we're empowering our own people. We're giving some of them permission to be knowledge workers. We're giving some of them permission to demonstrate their expertise, you know, to have the autonomy to deal with situations on their own, which is what all the millennials want us to say. So that's an important future-proofing. And you've got to hope that if we're improving both the standard part of the world and the case part of the world, we've got to get better at response. We've got to be able to step up from where we are now. So if we're empowering the knowledge workers and we're improving performance, one would also hope that we're going to improve morale. And Lord knows that the service desk in most organisations is a place where morale could use a little improving, right? So I'm quite excited about the cultural, you know, the people aspects of this whole thing in a big way. So Standard Plus Case. It applies in any human response situation where humans are responding to a situation. There's either a standard response or there isn't. That's the reality. Thanks very much.
Are you happy to take a couple of questions? Right, couple of questions. Rob's happy to take a couple on standard and case, and maybe you want to know how it might fit your particular organisation. So can we take the lights up a bit so we can see those hands raising in the background?
I know it's after lunch, but I hope I've stimulated some thought. Anyway.
There are some people still awake out there. I did hear the applause. Questions, anybody?
How do you see the biggest difference between this case worker versus the tier 1 and tier 2 class?
So what's the difference between standard to case and tier 1 to tier 2 support? They're not exactly analogous, but they're close, right? So typically the tier 1 people try and respond to something in a standard way, and if they can't, then they toss it to the tier 2 as the experts, right? So it's pretty close, but you know, potentially there is standardized response where you still need an expert to execute some of those steps. So you're passing standard stuff through to tier 2 as well. So it's close, but it's not a perfect match. They sort of, you know, they're not orthogonal, but they're not perfectly aligned. Does that answer your question?
Okay, great. Time for one or two more questions, if there are any out there. We have some microphones, so don't be bashful. They want to be bashful. Okay, well, Rob is going to be around over coffee, and he has another session later this afternoon, don't you? So, once again, thanks for coming all this way, Rob.
Thanks, everybody.
Introducing MyIT from BMC Software. One quick download, and the way your users think about IT changes forever. Let's say they need a networked printer, or a Wi-Fi connection, or even a map of an office they're visiting. MyIT already knows where they are, and shows them a list of available resources and services pre-configured for their devices. Or maybe your user needs help with something more complex. With MyIT, they can do most things themselves. But if they can't, they can simply schedule an appointment with a technician who can. In short, MyIT is built to make your IT organization more modern and your users infinitely happier, dramatically changing the perception of your services